Listen, Jubes, about this vampire business, if you'd ever wanted to talk about it, I am kind of an expert in the area of the undead. I even won an argument on the internet once. I'll tell you about it later. Hail, the Bard here, and it's time again for another cracking unboxing and review of a figure. And today we're looking at another example of a Japanese mutation of very Western fantasy themes in the form of Leina Vance from Queen's Blade. Should be good. Yes, it's another one of my girly figures, Mum. Jeez. Yo ho, and here we go. It's time for an unboxing, and I've got my trusty unboxing knife here, and it's time to release Leina from her stasis. Now you might ask, what is Queen's Blade? Well, as far as I'm able to gather, it's drawn from a series of fantasy combat books made by a company called Hobby Japan, who might well be, as far as I know, the Japanese equivalent of Games Workshop. Which is funny, because I did have a series of combat books made by Games Workshop back in the 90s called Warhammer Warriors. And I had Leonatos, I think, of the Blood Angels from Blood Quest. I had an Eldar Exarch. And it seems I can't even unbox a Queen's Blade figure without banging on about Warhammer for half an hour. Let me make the final incision here. So like all things that get popular in the Land of the Rising Sun, this did have an animated series to go with it. But to be honest with you, I didn't really like it. It didn't really make good on this premise of these mysterious and exotic warriors all coming together to fight in a tournament for the right to take the throne. That's what's going on in Deathstalker, for God's sake. And I like Deathstalker better than the Queen's Blade show they made. Why don't they make figures for this? Alright, so I didn't really like the show, and I've never played the game books, but what I did like were several of the character designs, and Leina here was my favourite. I also liked the pseudo-Egyptian mummy girl, returned from the dead, and the Protean assassin. They were really keen, but there were some that were just abominations. Like this thing here, whatever this is. I hate this design. Why is it on here? This abomination is one figure that we will never unbox here, my friends, I promise you that. I don't even want it in my house. Oh, demo, totemo genki desu ne. I don't want to hear it, Japan. And where's my dwarf? No, not that one. What is it with the Japanese and their compulsive need to ruin the majesty of dwarves and even elves by turning them into these weird Lolita monsters? At least we'll always have Dragon's Crown as the shining exception that proves the rule. But whatever, this is supposed to be a Leina unboxing, so I'm going to concentrate on what I'm doing. How many of these bits of tape have they got in here? Oh god, there's no more plastic in there, is there? The bloody plastic ambushes me every time. There we go. Right. Now I can finally get to the business. Plastic, it's happening already. How does this plastic come off? Why's it got to be so difficult? What the? Her head comes off? Oh my god, everything comes off. I knew nothing of this. Well, this figure just got a lot more interesting. Oh yeah, the base. I better put this back together before I break it. There's still a bit of plastic on her head. I didn't even solve the problem. Plastic and bases are the great hurdles of figure collecting. There's a sword too, which is really nice. There we go, Leina. Alright people, I got this. It turns out this figure has a gimmick that I didn't know about. Apparently this is one of a line of figures called cast-off figures, and I had to get on the internet to figure out how it works. Leina here has removable armour. Let's have a look and I'll try to show you what I mean. There we go, Leina can be displayed without her harness and topless as a result, which is in keeping with the spirit of Queen's Blade game books and the animated show, which are at least as much about cheesecake as they are about any kind of conflict. Well, this cast-off business came as a surprise, but a nice one. I really love the concept and how it gives you an alternate way to display your model. But you've got to be aware it was really difficult to figure out how to do it. It doesn't come with any illustrative instructions after all, and I had to consult the internet and other owners of this figure to make sure that I wasn't doing it wrong and potentially breaking it. The sticking point is these very tight belts around her hips here. It's very hard to wiggle the torso free, and if I didn't read up, I probably wouldn't know that's what you were supposed to do. I know one fellow at least who decided to sever these straps rather than do what I did and wiggle it free and have to clean up all of the brown paint that's rubbed off on her skin. But I did also read that Mega House, the designers of this model, and a lot of other Queen's Blade ones, have gotten a lot better at designing cast-off elements since 2006 when this one came out. But for Leina at least, although there is a knack to it, it is very difficult to remove this armour, especially the first time round. And as a result, I probably won't be taking it off again anytime soon. So, cast-off shenanigans aside, what do I think of this figure? Well, I really like it. Look at this great pose she's ducking down into with a high parry and the shield ready at her side, set to intercept any nonsense, probably from that Ghost Maid character. Another design I didn't like. But whatever. It's a pretty engaging sparring pose, and as you can see from the way her leather straps and hair is displaced, all of its momentum is directed downwards into this crouch, which reinforces the main visual focus of the figure, her butt. I'm serious, it is. And this isn't surprising considering this is a deliberately sexy figure from a deliberately sexy source material. But what I appreciate is that there was a bit of craft that went into drawing attention to it. It's actually integrated into the pose and in the dynamic of the figure. Her face and upper body are tucked under her guard and her midsection is drawn in. Her left side is warded by this armoured shield arm of hers, and all of this deflects the eye and stops it from settling in these places. This, coupled with the sudden crouch action, place all the tension of the model's movement, its sense of kinetic energy in her arse and thighs, which are given a sense of action rather than inaction that play into the warrior status of the character. This is a real step above simply presenting the body flatly in a meaningless and pedestrian gesture towards eroticism. I like it. If you don't make use of the cast-off feature, then the effect is even stronger, as these crisscrossing leather bands create extra displacement, and there is a greater degree of contrast between Leina's smooth skin and her rigid, shining armour. Speaking of, Megahouse did a great job bringing out the shiny, silvery steel effect on Leina's armour here with a nice blue glaze. That's a trick you learn early on in your Warhammer career. The effect is particularly good on Leina's shield, which I've always loved the design of, and I can hear people muttering about practicality already. This is one way of telling when someone has an underdeveloped imagination, when they get caught up on practicality, on things like this in fantasy art. To me, this is an invitation to the imagination, a chance to wonder at what deadly fighting style or exotic weapon it was made to counter. Maybe it was made to fight against some xenomorphic monster or supernatural menace, and that's all without getting into the possibilities of symbolism that such a thing might carry. Certainly for a chivalric character like Leina here, the symbolism of heraldry and armour is of paramount importance. Leina is a great example of the knightly paradox, the conflict between two identities. The natural one that is born and represented in the body, and the artificial one which is created and represented in the armour. I see revealing armour like this disparaged all the time, but it's actually a wonderful way to put these two identities in direct contrast, even a state of flux that highlights the conflict between them. This is something that happens with Lancelot in the Arthurian myths and is represented beautifully in the film Excalibur as he fights against himself, his naked body struggling against his armour. Leina's character design tells us that she has a similar problem, that her warrior identity is something that she co-opts from her armour, and that it isn't who she really is, at least not yet. And it turns out that she is a noble runaway, rejecting one constructed identity by assuming another. There's a kind of irony here in that the noble warrior identity she is assuming is a vestige of the more political noble identity she is rejecting. Hence all of these restrictive looking straps around her. These are the literal ties that bind. The visual of Leina calibrates us for all this, and does so at a glance, which is a good indicator of strong character design, and it's represented well on the model at hand. For example, this well-defined abdominal muscularity represents the kind of strength and invulnerable warrior credibility only available to Leina through the surrogacy of her armour. Like Lancelot, there is a gulf between her rigid warrior body and her soft, vulnerable, actual body. And the sculptor of this figure found a clever way to highlight Leina's lack of actual warrior hardness. It's right here in the way the band of her combat undies bites into the flesh at her hip. It's subtle, but it's right on the model's posterior focal point. It's very clever. As much as I really like this model, there's a couple of flaws, and it would be remiss of me not to talk about them a little bit. For a start, I have to admit that I don't really understand this base. It's a lovely shade of blue, but I don't think it synergizes all that well with the rest of the figure. Any good miniature gamer will tell you how important a base is to the composition of a model overall, and this is true for figures like this as well. I'll give you some examples. A black base, like Poison's, separates the model from the surface it's displayed on and isolates it visually. A base can be stylised like the sparkly one that belongs to Jubilee, and calls to mind something about that character that might not be present on the model itself. And Tiki here can be seen as having a scenic base, or no base at all, allowing the model to integrate fully with the surface it's on, as the opposite of Poison. It's just a bag of money on a table, with a fairy on it. There's more types, of course, but these are just some that work, and I don't think Leina's does. This might be a really subjective thing, and it could well be that this plays into Leina's character somehow, and I never got very far in the animated series after all. But at the same time, this alleged elf has this awful green base that just clashes and really does nothing for the model, so I don't know. There's a really visible seam right on Leina's crown too. Now this kind of join isn't uncommon, you see it a lot, even Tiki's got one hidden just behind the fringe. But usually it's concealed by the detail of the hair, which is something that Leina just doesn't have. It's true that this is just how Leina is drawn, but that just makes me think a different technique could have been used. Maybe it wasn't an option at the time, but it's there all the same. Lastly, there is this join at Leina's elbow. This is a side effect of the cast-off feature, but this is the only such join that isn't well concealed. This is where I start to feel that this cast-off thing isn't really worth it. Because if you use it, then you lose either these lovely dense straps at her shoulders, or the contrast of her armour, or both. And if you don't use it, you still have this seam sticking out at her elbow. It's more visible than it looks. I would have preferred that this model have no cast off, but others from the same line might pull it off a little bit better, I don't know. Maybe we'll find out someday. For me personally though, these flaws are just trifles, because I like this figure and this character so much that I don't even really see them. This is a great first impression for Mega House, and while I'm not a Queensblade fan by any stretch of the imagination, now after all, for every character that I like, I know there is at least one that I really don't. If I see another figure like this, of a character that I like and a good pose from Queensblade, sure, we'll check it out, no problem. I know there are tons of characters that I haven't even seen yet, so we'll have a look. But for now, I'm off to watch Deathstalker. That's how you fight for a crown.